and experience packed into the meeting and in discussions. And if you're new to it, I would encourage you to ask questions and to get involved in the activity yourself, because that's the best way you learn about the tactics to fight anti-fascism and what we do about it today. I want to come back on a couple of the questions that people raised, starting with the question about the Night of the Long Knives. For those who don't know, the Night of the Long Knives was in 1934, where Hitler purged some of the key Nazi figures within the Nazi party, including Ernst Röhm, who was one of his closer collaborators, many of whom were associated with the brown shirts, the essay that I put on the screen earlier. The tensions within that came about because Ernst Röhm and others argued that once Hitler had taken power, which he had a year previously, that a second revolution was needed. And they argued a second revolution was needed because they wanted to make real some of the promises that Hitler had made about the middle class and the lower middle class that I talked about being lifted up to a higher place in society. So Hitler's inability to deliver on his programme created tensions within the Nazi party. And that's the kind of tensions that I wanted to outline in the beginning about the inherent instability within the Nazi project, of their project of a national revolution and of marrying the street and parliamentary wings. So the question for us as anti-fascists is, how do we build a movement to exploit those tensions and to destroy the Nazis? One way we won't do that is what the comrade talked about voting. The SPD, the Social Democratic Party, told all their members to vote against the Nazis. It didn't work. And they didn't mobilise their members, they didn't tell their members to come out in the streets, to go on strike, to march against the Nazis. They told them to vote, and it didn't work. But if you look today, look at the case of France. Macron, who's the current president of France, and all the liberal media commentators and so on, say, stop Le Pen, vote Macron. And they said, stop Le Pen, vote Sarkozy. And they said, stop Le Pen, vote Chirac. And they said, stop Le Pen, vote Hollande. In other words, people who've been stopping Le Pen by voting for the least worst option for 20 years, what's happened? Le Pen's now on 41%. The vote has gone up from 15% to 41%. So that tactic of vote for the least worst option to keep out the fascists hasn't worked. Why hasn't it worked? Because every single one of those presidents that I mentioned, Chirac, I don't know if this is the right order, Chirac, Hollande, Sarkozy, and Macron, all of them have pushed through neoliberal attacks. They've attacked people's living standards, made them work longer, attacked their pensions, attacked their rights at work, and so on. And they've whipped up the most disgusting Islamophobia. The Islamophobia of the French state, of telling women what to wear, of telling Muslims they don't have a place in French society, both those two things have created more space for the fascists. So they've opened the road to the fascists because of those policies. And now we have to vote for them. Should we vote? Are they going to say again in 2027, the main way to stop the pen is to vote for the same people who are creating room for the fascists? We have to fight for an alternative strategy. And if, in France, we have the biggest Muslim population in Europe, we have the biggest Jewish population in Europe, we have the biggest left in Europe as well, Mélenchon got 22% at the last election, and there's huge unions who go on strike a lot. And by the way, in France, you don't have to give 2 weeks' notice, you can go on strike like that. If those three sections of society were brought together in a mass anti-fascist campaign that said they would march on Le Pen, launch campaigns in local areas, we could beat her. But they don't. And therefore what we're talking about a vision of a militant anti-fascism from below that does those things, is what we're trying to do with Stand Up to Racism, with Unite Against Fascism, and the Anti-Nazi League. And the question of the United Front, therefore, is a very important one for us, because our starting point, when we're talking about the United Front, is that in the SWP, we think, really, you won't get rid of the threat of fascism unless you get rid of capitalism. We think that capitalism will create the conditions of despair that open the road to the fascists, and it will whip up the racism that legitimises their language. So, as revolutionaries in the SWP, we think to fight fascism, you have to fight capitalism. However, if we were the only people to mobilise against the fascists, it would be way too small. We would be tiny. We wouldn't be enough to do it. Even if you look at an organisation like the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, with millions, they did mobilise against the fascists. From 1928 onwards, they did actually mobilise physically, but they were too small to stop it. So, our argument is that this is our view. You have to get rid of capitalism to fight fascism. But we're saying, even if you don't agree with that, if you agree that we need to fight the fascists, even if you vote Labour, you vote Green, you're not an anti-capitalist, we should unite. We should unite together to fight the fascists. We can get the most numbers out, we can get the most social weight, and we can build the biggest demonstrations and campaigns. That's what the United Front is about. And we think it's been proven correct over time. Cable Street in 1936 that Mark Krantz talked about, the 1977 movement against the anti-Nazi League, the United Against Fascism movement against the BNP and the EDL here, and what we did against Tommy Robinson that comrades talked about. And what makes it different from the Popular Front is the idea that we should line up with those in power, with elements of the state, and with the liberal mainstream parties, and that's the way in which you fight fascism. So if famously in Spain in 1936, the Stalinist Communist Party argued to stop the revolution, it argued to stop the anti-fascist mobilisations from below, and it argued to team up with the more moderate Republicans so that it could please the international powers like France and Britain to intervene. That strategy was proved wrong. What does the Popular Front look like today? There's been a big debate raging about this. Journalists like Paul Mason, people might know, have argued that the way to stop the fascists is to work with elements of the state like the police, to work with organisations like the Democrats, and to team up with people like Macron in France. I think this is a strategy which has proven to be bankrupt. What we're arguing, the United Front, is to mobilise working class forces from below as a way to fight the fascists. And that brings me to the question, very important and good question, that was raised about what about workers who support fascism? Or is it true that the working class are more open to fascism? I think we have to be careful with this narrative. If you look at the breakdown of votes of every fascist party and movement, they are weakest in the big cities, where most working class people are. It's true of the Nazis. If you look at the Nazi breakdown of votes, their vote was mainly from the countryside. The Nazis never cracked Berlin or Munich, the working class districts. Never cracked it. Even right up until 1933, if you look at the vote share, it's quite low. Again, if you look at the Front National, Le Pen's party in France at the moment, she has built her base in the countryside and in the suburbs of towns. So it's not often true. And there is this narrative, isn't there, that working class people are more racist, more sexist, and probably more open to fascist ideas. And when they say that, they're talking about white working class people, the white working class. We should remember that racism does not come from below. Racism comes from the top of society. Who's whipping up is Islamophobia? It's those at the top, it's the press, it's the politicians. Who's telling us that refugees are the problem? It's Downing Street, it's Rupert Murdoch. That's where racism comes from in society. And if you want an example about the relationship between the working class and fascism, think about the fact that every mass anti-fascist movement has had the working class at the heart of it. Who stopped the Oswald Mosley in Cable Street? It was the trade unions. It was the Communist Party. Who stopped the National Front in 1977? It was us. It was the left. It was the working class. And I think, therefore, we have to think how we do that, because there's no such thing, I think, as a white working class. Look in Manchester. The working class is black, it's white, it's trans, it's able, it's disabled. That is what can do the real damage to the fascists. And when the working class moves, when they struggle, as you're seeing at the moment, with some of the biggest strikes we've seen as a decade, you can see that those ideas can get more of a pull than the racist ones. And the ruling class know it. Why is it that in the biggest strike wave in decades, why is it that Rishi Sunak is playing the racism card as hard as possible by blaming the 10 people who are coming over in boats? He's doing that because he knows if he plays that card, it can divide the working class. The final thing then I want to finish on is about the relationship between capitalism and fascism. And I want to put this in the context of today. We know that capitalism is going through a deep, multifaceted and sustained crisis at every level. Climate crisis, pandemic, but also crucially the crisis of the economy and the dire economic conditions that we face. That crisis of capitalism is going to create the conditions for the far right to grow. They are growing, but it's going to accelerate. If capitalism remains intact, we are going to see more Melonis, more Le Pens, and we are going to see them build up a street army in the way that Hitler wanted. That will be their aim, in the same way that Hitler did. Our vision, therefore, has to be that in this time of immense crisis, as it did in Germany in the 1930s, the question of politics and of anti-fascism matters. It matters how much anti-fascists there are, but it also matters about the politics of who's leading that anti-fascist movement. If you agree that we have to confront the fascists at every turn, that we have to fight them on the streets, campaign against them, but you also agree that we have to get rid of the system which creates the potential for them to grow, then you should think about joining the Socialist Workers' Party. You should think about filling in one of those red forms and being part of an organisation which has been at the heart of every anti-fascist struggle in Britain, will continue to be so, but will also link those struggles against the fight against the system. The more anti-fascists there are makes a difference, but the more revolutionary socialists there are makes a bigger difference. If you agree with that, you should think about joining us.